Thank you for those insights on the UN collective outcomes to our previous speakers. We will dive right into the next spotlight session where Pakistan will feature as a case study. And I think many of the aspects mentioned in the previous session are also relevant for this session. So indeed, these sessions are designed to shed a spotlight on some crucial or controversial aspect of the Triple Nexus, and in this case, we will look at Pakistan. My name is Sonja Hövelmann, and I work as a research fellow with the Center for Humanitarian Action. Within the scope of our research project, I traveled to Pakistan to conduct research and will discuss some of the findings with my dear colleague Jennifer Ankrom-Khan from Action Against Hunger. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So some of the key findings from my research were indeed that discussions on the Triple Nexus in Pakistan are much less at the forefront if we compare it to, for example, contexts such as Mali or Somalia. And indeed, two aspects make it quite sensitive, a quite sensitive discussion. For one, Pakistan is under huge international pressure to comply with counterterrorism measures. And secondly, is involved in international as well as internal conflict. And these two aspects indeed lead to domestic focus within Pakistan rather on short-term stabilization strategies as opposed to more long-term peace outcomes. And I think this is really crucial to keep in mind when we look at the Pakistani context, which is indeed rather militarized and restrictive. And yet, at the same time, quite an interesting context to study a concern that is frequently mentioned by humanitarian actors: how do we maintain independence and impartiality if the state indeed becomes a central coordinating figure in this nexus approach, which may not, as it is the case in Pakistan, necessarily give all actors the space to adhere to their principles. So to discuss these and other issues, joining us from Islamabad is Jennifer Ankrom-Khan, who's the country director of Action Against Hunger Pakistan. She's in a perfect position to reflect on issues that are relevant in the Pakistani context. She has been working in Pakistan for almost or more than 12 years, both for local and international organizations. She is also very involved in policy discussions in Pakistan, being a member of the Pakistan Humanitarian Forum, which is an international INGO forum, but also is a member of the National Steering Committee of the START network. With that, I would like to pose my first question to you, Jennifer. Given your long-term experience in Pakistan, how relevant is an interlinked response or an interlinked approach in Pakistan, factoring in humanitarian development, but also conflict-related challenges? With that, over to you.
Sure. So maybe I'll start about each of these contexts in their own light. So if I talk about the climate and the natural disasters in Pakistan. Pakistan is the 5th most affected by climate change in the last 20 years globally, according to German Watch. And if we look this year alone, there's been floods, heat waves, locusts, heavy snowfall, earthquakes are quite frequent here. And the projections for the climate disasters in Pakistan is no brighter. You have heat bubbles predicted, you've got increased salinity and drought, and just generally unpredictable climatic conditions. In recent years, the frequency has visibly increased. And interestingly, unlike many countries in the world, there's not a single political party here which denies climate change is happening here. If we look at the conflict setting, Pakistan has been hosting Afghan refugees since the 1970s. You've got officially registered 1.7 million Afghan refugees, and almost the same estimated to be living here as undocumented Afghans. Since 2008, there has been internal conflict in Pakistan's tribal areas, which has resulted in several waves of displacement internally. And while the situation is now much more stable and most of these displaced persons have now returned, they continue to face challenges in their recovery, made worse by continued security concerns, leading to local curfews and impediments to their economic activity in their places of origin. In addition to that, as we will all see on the global news, there are notable issues along the line of control, which have, with Kashmir, which have increased in recent years. And there's more curfews, there's more forms of conflict in the border areas, and particularly in the Indian administered side of Kashmir. There's also internal insecurity in Balochistan, particularly. This is despite considerable improvement in the security context in general in the country. But the figures of Balochistan are vague, but there is visible migration from more insecure areas of Balochistan to those with better security, and also to Karachi, which is the largest city nearby. When we talk about development, Pakistan also has areas to improve. It's 152 out of 189 countries in the Humanitarian Development Index. And when you use the inequality lens, the HDI lens drops, the HDI score drops, sorry, and as it does when you factor in gender. In 2018, there was a national nutrition survey, something very close to the mandate of ACF. 63% are food insecure, 40% of children are stunted, wasting standards 18%, which is above the emergency threshold. So this just gives you one angle of development. Also, just looking at out of school children, there's 22.8 million children estimated to be out of school, not attending school. And so what we see is that across a number of different contexts, that there are areas that need to be worked on. And now if we look at the cross-sectorality of these different areas, yes, in areas where there's lower education, there is more conflict. In areas with more climate change disasters, they also have lower socioeconomic indicators. But the analysis of what's causing each other and the interrelations between these factors are weak at the moment. For example, does drought and its impact on resources cause the internal conflict in Balochistan, or is it vice versa? This is still not really considered in this context. So in answer to your query, there remains issues on each pole of the Triple Nexus within Pakistan, and many issues that can be worked on. But right now, the relevance of each part of the nexus independently is understood much better than the interrelation between the different poles of the nexus.
Thanks so much for those insights. Indeed, it seems that there are quite a lot of interlinked challenges, especially if we look at, for example, the nutrition sector. And indeed, I think the UN thought so as well. At least they selected Pakistan as an official pilot country for the UN World Bank approach, which is rolled out in the tribal areas, former FATA areas, which have been merged with the KP province, so Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, where militancy has been very prevalent. Many civilians have been, as you just outlined, repeatedly displaced. Yet the pilot approach is quite contested. So, for example, Neil Bune, the former humanitarian coordinator, but also resident coordinator in Pakistan, is said to have been very hesitant to present Pakistan as a case study on the international center stage. And as I outlined also from the research finding in the beginning, these reasons really factor in that the Pakistani authorities, so the prevalence of counterterrorism measures, but also the very restricted environment, that Pakistani authorities are indeed keeping a very close eye on civil society actors and also on foreign actors. With that said, I think while the overall approach is a bit controversial, can you share some civil society perception on this overall approach and perhaps also link it with how civil society, but also humanitarian actors navigate this very politically charged space.
Sure. I want to start by just stressing on, and I'm sure that a lot of the people here will know this, but Pakistan is a country with a very strong state. And therefore, the civil society is very much contributed to, but not the owner of the space for development, humanitarian and peace in the country. Our role as civil society is very different to that which can emerge in other countries. And we have to be cognizant that we do not have the full command of the space, and therefore we have to comply with the regulations and the requirements of the government here. I think when we talk about the Triple Nexus pilot that you refer to, led by the UN and the World Bank, civil society has not been a very active player in this. This is a typical scenario for us in country. I think this is one of the concerns of us as civil society, that our largest recognition and our largest space exists within humanitarian action. As soon as we move beyond the humanitarian action space to discussing development issues, peace issues, our voice, our collective voice, and the voice of the communities that we represent is depleted. And there's many reasons for this. But if I were to even give you an example of the role of OCHA, when OCHA exists in coordinating emergencies, in most cases, it enables the civil society to take part in the emergency context and the humanitarian discussions. However, there has been a downscaling of the role of OCHA and a phase out of clusters. It was a staggered phase out in different locations to become thematic working groups. And these have been led jointly by the government of Pakistan with the UN. And as soon as this comes on board, there are a few exceptions. There is one working group, the WASH working group, where it's actually also co-led by civil society. But those that don't have a co-leadership by civil society we as civil society find it much harder to engage in the discussions, even in the humanitarian sector. And when you talk about the development sector, that is even more pronounced. Or where we're involved, it's a very small number of civil society actors that are involved in the discussion. If we look at the double hatting, I know this was referred to in previous discussions as well, the double hatting of the humanitarian coordinator and resident coordinator, it's not a one size fits all. And sometimes having that double hatting has actually given us more chance to have a say in the development context. But at the same time, there has been some contexts, well, many, I would say, where because of the dual mandate, when we as civil society have raised concerns through the HCT or through our platforms on certain principles or actions going on at the time, the dual mandate has meant that the resident coordinators sometimes preference development over some of the difficult discussions that need to be had on humanitarian principles. And often it will be this reference to humanitarian imperative or the development agenda over the humanitarian principles, and this practical approach which has been adopted in many contexts. And it should be noted that these challenges are not universal, and the management and programs in areas which are non-conflict setting, the ability of us to inform those is much higher than in conflict settings, and the ability of us to operate is also much higher. For example, if we are to receive a no objection certificate, which is the formal approval we need to start working in our projects, it's very easy in a non-conflict setting, but in a conflict setting, it's very difficult for us. It can take months to negotiate. So in summary, I would say that civil society traditionally has a very strong voice in the humanitarian settings. Beyond that, it's not always, it depends on the organization, on the context. In the current pilot, I think because it is a pilot potentially, but also because it's in a very complex environment and a very sensitive environment, where there's recently been conflict, where there's still ongoing issues in the area, civil society has had a very limited role in that. And this is the risk of moving towards this triple nexus approach, is the fact that the role of civil society may be less rather than more.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Very interesting. Also within my research, a lot of the interviewees hinted that the one UN approach, which was also piloted in Pakistan, where basically the UN agencies were merged to have one leadership, one office, one budget, also impacts on, for example, the humanitarian branch, so being OCHA, to firewall humanitarian principles, and that this tendency is still impacting on the perception from on humanitarian actors still today. Before I give room to also questions that our online audience might have posed in the chat, I would like to linger a little bit on perhaps an outlook. So if indeed the UN pilot is a rather sensitive issue, or also perhaps there's still some learning to do it better perhaps in the future, if this seems a fitting approach for Pakistan. What options are there for civil societies to collaborate outside of this this framework? Because, as you stated in the beginning, the relevance for the triple nexus approach is indeed quite prevalent for the Pakistani context. Perhaps elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, sure. I think I would also just start by maybe discussing something slightly different, which is that I think we need to reflect on the principled action debate beyond the boundaries of Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that the Pakistan state is not working independently. They are required to comply with counterterrorism legislation, FATF. There's a lot of pressure on the government to do this. And this has been directly quoted in the decisions they've made on our registration documents. So it's not a pure decision by the government of Pakistan to restrict NGOs. And I think that this is an interesting debate that can take place beyond just the context of Pakistan. And I think we're actually at a point where we maybe in country and globally, we need to reflect on the humanitarian principles and the abilities of countries and civil society to implement these. Given some of the demands of donors, of international legislation, it's becoming increasingly questionable how possible this is. Irrespective of whether we adopt the dual or the triple nexus, even within humanitarian action alone, it's not so straightforward. I think the other thing that I would say that in countries like Pakistan, the context is huge. We have 4 large provinces with populations which can range up to 30 million in each province, the size of countries, with their own independent governments and with their own independent issues in many cases. And I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not that the triple nexus can't be done. It's in which context can the triple nexus be done? In which context does this whole debate or the difficulties with implementing the triple nexus and its implication on independence and the sanctity in some ways of the humanitarian principles, in some contexts, this isn't possible. If we look at it for our programs, for example, for nutrition, it's quite easy to navigate the dual nexus. Particularly for us in Sindh, which is a non-conflict setting, we can work on the emergency responses needed. We can work on the development issues, the underlying causes of nutrition. So we've managed to do it through one lens in one area. However, I believe an en bloc move to a triple nexus across the country, and even I can understand the concerns of the previous resident coordinator of the triple nexus being in that particular context, because it is a highly sensitive context. And maybe what needs to happen is that we should look at the less sensitive ones first and move towards a pilot in those areas. I think that, for example, you'd actually mentioned to me previously, could we adopt a slightly more conflict sensitive approach in some of our other programs? So, for example, you're doing a shelter project in a diverse community, which is a very common thing, for example, in Sindh, as I was mentioning. You have many different ethnic groups, religious groups. If you don't select those beneficiaries properly, what will be the implication on the peace in that community in the longer term? So there are ways to start thinking about the approach and to start piloting the approach. And I think by piloting it in these less sensitive locations, we can also work with the government to produce an approach that they want. Because as I said at the beginning, this is a country with a strong state. We will not see humanitarian action happening without the government of Pakistan. And we will not see any of the poles of the nexus effectively being implemented with a sustainable approach without the government of Pakistan.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for these reflections. Perhaps I'll turn to my colleague Charlotte, who's been monitoring the chat for me. How lively was the chat? Can you share some questions with us?
Yes, happily, Sonja. And thank you also, Jennifer, for your input. So far from the chat, we've had one question stemming from Themriz Khan. I hope I said that correctly. So the question is as follows. What is your impression on the civil-military relations in Pakistan in humanitarian and development activities? Do you feel that they are more responsive to the larger UN system and less to the Pakistani local NGOs, or vice versa? I think that the chat would like some input on that. Thank you.
Sure. I think, this is again a good example of where the Pakistan state is very active, and we can't view interventions without viewing what the role of the government will be and where we can support the government in their action. For example, the military is nearly always the first responder for every disaster in country. And this has happened for many, many years, and it will continue to happen. So it's about working together with them beyond the humanitarian setting. When we talk about the development setting, I think that there's less of an active role of the military in the development setting. So there's less discussions of civil military. And again, if we look at humanitarian action, it does depend on the context. So where you have a conflict peace setting, it's obviously a much more active civil military relations in those kind of settings than in others. Do I feel they're more responsive to the larger UN system and less to Pakistani NGOs? I think when we look at the military, it's a huge institution. And the main way in which we communicate with the military is through the HCT when it comes to the humanitarian settings. And therefore, they're responsive to the humanitarian coordinator. So whether you call that the UN system or not, they don't have time to sit down with each and every NGO and discuss. Yes, when it comes to certain areas in the country, actually the coordination mechanism is managed by the military. So this has been the case in the TDP response, as it's called, temporarily dislocated people. Some of the last wave of displaced communities from the ex-FATA, this whole response was coordinated by the military. So and in those cases, they were getting very involved, even with the small NGOs, on where you were working, what kind of activities you were doing. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I understand we have one more question, and we pose that to you, and perhaps this also gives you the opportunity to reflect on any final words or statement that you would like to make, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you. I think this question actually ties in quite nicely with what you were just saying. So the question is, in this strong and deep state context we were discussing, what is the future of protection-focused organizations, both local and international?
I think I'm not a protection specialist, so I don't want to comment on their behalf too much. I think it depends on what element of protection we're looking at. I think that some elements of protection are easier to discuss than others in country. I know that there is much more discussion on child rights, for example, at the moment. In country, there's very high-profile cases of where there have been abuses of rights of women, of children, and this is irrespective of the civil society involvement. This is the general response by the government, is the response by the general population in country and the media. So in some of the contexts, there is an ability of the protection actors to work more actively than in the past. I think it really depends on what we're discussing in terms of protection, like I said. But if we are talking in terms of the peace access of the Triple Nexus, I think it's actually also that this is not being discussed. The analysis to be able to inform a response it's not mature enough at this point. So yes, in the context of ex-Fata, there have been these discussions, but they were not that inclusive. And when we look at the protection issues in other locations, the discussion, like I said, is still quite immature. And as a result, I think there is an area for discussion. I think that the government should be part of that discussion. And I hope that in the coming months, we'll see more of this.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Would you like to have a final statement, or are you good with the last question?
Sure. I would just wrap up by saying, as I said, I think it's not a one-size-fits-all in all parts of Pakistan. And I think that, yes, it is a sensitive topic when we just immediately assume the access parts and the access implications of a triple nexus. But there are also a lot of opportunities. And I think if it's explained properly and we do a trust building exercise with the government, it is possible to move beyond where we are at the moment, which is quite separate actors working in each of the poles of the nexus. And I think that this is something that particularly the current humanitarian resident coordinator, he is starting to initiate this discussion. And I do hope that we will see some movement coming, particularly in, as I said, maybe starting in the less sensitive areas in the country.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for braving this discussion, given the sensitivities around it. To wrap up, Annika said in the previous session that collective outcomes do not make sense in every context. And I think we heard a little bit that the politicization of the nexus is indeed quite huge in the Pakistani context in those tribal areas. So it might cause more misunderstandings, more constraints for principled actors. While indeed there may be more potential in other provinces where issues are a bit less complex, a bit less sensitive. Jennifer also hinted that there's enough homework to do with regard to the dual nexus. So one possibility that there is room for action integrating crisis modifiers in the development schemes, for example, in multi-sectoral schemes, but also that the issue of protection, specifically also child protection, that there's still room to improve also with regard to trust building with the government to ensure a better interlinked approach. With this, we will end the spotlight session. Thanks so much to Jennifer, but also to the audience for those questions. Again, we will take 30-second, 1-minute break, and then the next spotlight session on a localized approach featuring the case study of Somalia will play. Stay tuned.